Alright, what's up? It's almost 9 o'clock at night. I have a cup of coffee that is not decaf because I'm stupid. And I haven't touched this channel in a year. So I think that's a great start. So for those of you who don't know, hi, I'm Nate. Although chances are if you're finding me, you probably do know who I am. If you don't, count yourself fortunate. But, I kind of wanted to sit down and talk. Not because it's like, oh, some big life thing. I've tried to do that in the past. No, like, that doesn't really work. Especially when I'm just talking to a camera and making sure, like, do I stare at the screen that's displaying my face or the camera itself, but then there's nothing interesting with the camera itself. I'm not good at recording, is what I'm trying to say. And so, I kind of wanted this to be more of a rant video. I know, it sounds like I'm going to say some really rancid political opinions. Nothing of that here, because I'm talking about video games. I know, another white boy with glasses talking about video games. But I think this is something that's kind of just been sitting on my mind for a while. I'm not trying to do a review. I'm not trying to do an in-depth analysis of game mechanics or speedrunning histories. I'm not that, although I could. I don't think I'm really, my brain don't work like that. Because I kind of wanted to talk about Elden Ring, which, that's what I'm talking about. Because it's kind of just sat in the back of my mind for a while. And my experiences with this game is something I kind of just want to talk about. Something I want to put out there. I'll get a couple things out of the way beforehand. If you don't play video games, I'm not saying start with Elden Ring. That's a very bad idea. But I'm saying if you do, maybe give Elden Ring a chance. Everybody gets something different out of it. If you're not into open world games, if you're not into Souls-like, fine. Play something else. Manifold Garden, Hyper Light Drifter, Ori and the Blind Forest, Risk of Rain 2. There, 4 recommendations that are different games. Ultra Kill 2, add a 5th. Very different games from Elden Ring. Feel free to play those. With Elden Ring, I think sort of the way I came around to it is something that I kind of want to just mention. I've never played a Souls-like before Elden Ring, and I'm kind of working on Dark Souls 3, but I don't really feel the same, like, want to get good at Dark Souls 3 like I really felt with Elden Ring. So yeah. So I think something that's important to get out of the way, that was a very awkward pause, is that when I think about video games, there are a couple factors that I really, really care about. Story, for example, is one. I'm not saying it has to have super in-depth lore, but if there's a base story, it's gotta be good. Like, develop your themes, guys. Have dialogue that doesn't suck. It's not hard. And there are several different ways that games do this. Take a game like Transistor, for example, which I finished a couple months ago, which, another game you should play. Because with that game, it kind of presents you with a story. Like, here are the bosses. Here's what you need to do. But then, as the game goes on, it subverts that with a completely separate story that's a lot more intimate. And I think that's a really good thing. It's not the fact that it faked out, it's that it had the promise of a story that was fine, and then gave you something completely different that was so much better. And another example of this is, well, actually, I'll give a couple. Hold on, words. Hyper Light Drifter. Hyper Light Drifter is another game I finished recently, where there's no words. There's not a single piece of legible words other than, like, instructions where it's like, open the map with this, here's a quick guide on stuff, and then that goes away and you're left with symbols, glyphs. I don't know if they mean anything, but at the same time there's the promise of those meaning something that makes it a lot more interesting. It doesn't give you a bad story, and it doesn't give you a super in-depth good story, but it leaves you with the promise of one, which I think is very interesting. And Ultra Kill 2, which I mentioned earlier, the game, for most of the time, it's got a story, but you don't really care. Playing the game, you're a robot that shoots coins. It's just fun. But then, there are these little tidbits of this sweet, juicy story work that's so incredibly interesting. You've got details on bosses like Minos and Sisyphus, and heck, even Gabrielle, where you suddenly sort of learn more about how you're going about things, and essentially what the things is. And right now, speaking where Ultra Kill just got the Weight of the World update, well, just a couple months ago, and that left with an ARG that had that revealed, not only had a huge bombshell, but it kind of changes the whole way you look at the game. And that's not even necessary. I just looked that up on YouTube. Like, And it doesn't really change the game at all. It just changes your perception of it. That's great story stuff. And I think an example of this being done badly that I want to say is Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild, for a while, was my favorite game. And to an extent, I still love it. It's still probably in my top 5. And playing the game is a lot of fun. Everybody bitches about the durability mechanic. I don't care. It's just a fun game. It's a very cozy game, and it feels like one of those things you can pick up and just remember, this is what video games are for. Distraction from life. I'm just gonna sit down with a Switch and headphones and ignore everything else, probably to my detriment. But just this coziness that really draws you in. What Breath of the Wild doesn't have is a good story. It has... The problem is, the thing I mentioned with Hyper Light Drifter, where there's the idea of maybe there's a story here. Maybe there's something that if I go through the effort to unpack it, it'll be worth it. But at the same time, it's so beautiful that it doesn't need to be there. Breath of the Wild has this weird balance where it simultaneously shoves the story in your face and also tells you, you have to go find the story. And then, when you go finding the story, you have this weird clash between these excellent cutscenes that show emotion, that show these developments of Zelda's character, and the champions, well, the champions to a lesser extent, like, some of them didn't have the super developed characters, even with the DLC. But all of those, it sort of had this promise of, these are like fleshed out characters, this is a lot here, there's a lot to unpack. And then you actually get back to the game, and there's none of that. You get back to the game, and while there's the promise of all this stuff, the Zelda in the cutscenes is not the Zelda in the game, because the Zelda in the game's like, oh, please save me, I'm doing nothing. Oh no. Whereas, like, in the game's own world, she's presented as literally keeping everything from collapsing. In actual execution, it feels more like just the same damsel in distress story that happens every time before. It essentially kills its own story. And with the world building, it tries to do what Hyper Light Drifter does by having the promise of, oh, there's more here. But then at the same time, there's not enough there where it feels like it just gives this sort of tantalizing hint of, the world building, lore, look at this, look at this. And then when you go looking for it, it feels like the game's laughing at you, like, haha, they're not getting that till the sequel. Cough it. And getting back on track, Elden Ring doesn't do that. And that's part of the reason why Elden Ring was something that really struck for me, because I first did a playthrough, and I believe I got to... I believe where I got stuck was Farum Azula, so pretty late game. But at the same time, I was just kind of going through the game. I wasn't doing much exploration. I was doing some, but I wasn't taking the time to get good at the combat, to understand the story, understand the world. I wasn't really doing anything. I was just kind of playing the game and expecting story. And Elden Ring doesn't do that. Sure, it gives you cutscenes, sure, it gives you, like, dialogue, but you don't get all this story stuff. And so I kind of just, like, got stuck, tried another playthrough, got more stuck, and then I just kind of let the game sit and steep for a while. And through that time, I saw more videos on Elden Ring's lore. I think a great example is, of course, Bloody Vidya, which, of course, I was going to mention him. And in there, as I started to sort of draw some pieces of, like, the lore and stuff, I'm like, okay, there's a story here. And it's not like Breath of the Wild where it's a fake out. There's a lot here to be delved into. And so, eventually, I started a new playthrough. I went through, I tried a build I hadn't really done before, mixed intelligence. I had completed bosses, done through side quests that I hadn't really done before. I talked to new NPCs. I did so many new things. And because of that, I kind of came around to the world a lot more. Instead of, that boss being cool. Like, taking a fight like Radahn. When you play the game and you don't care about the story, Radahn is still cool. That's still an awesome fight. But at the same time, playing it knowing the story behind it, at least for me, I'm not saying you have to be a lore whiz to understand stuff. I'm still not really a lore whiz anyway. I just kind of take what people say. I know, so smart, so intelligent. In a fight like Radahn, where you go at it from the lore, it's so much, it feels like so much more than just that boss fight. Because you have an idea as to Radahn's character. You have an idea of how he got to that state other than, like, you know, Melania stabbed him. There's all these interconnected webs of different goals and different ideas that makes it feel like this is like the history of a video game world rather than the story of a video game world. Because actual history, there's so many different elements, there's so many different like tiny details that change everything. There's so many perspectives, stories that we just can't fully wrap our heads around. And Elden Ring feels like it does that. It gives the player that gift of having this world that feels like you could never fully grasp it, but at the same time, it allows you the ability to try, which is just freaking amazing. I think another, sort of going off the idea of story, I think how Elden Ring handles its themes is very, very smart, very intelligent. For example, going throughout the game, when you start, the first idea of what's going on is pretty simple. You're a Tarnished, you need to repair the Elden Ring. You're the good guy, which, alright, you're playing as a good guy in a video game. That's wild. Like, whoa, breaking new ground here. But at the same time, every time the game seems to introduce you to a character or something, a character or a faction that seems benevolent, does one of two things. For characters, it either sort of rips the band-aid away and shows you the character they were, or, and this is far rarer, it gives you a full development of their character and has them, because there's barely any NPCs that actually survive the game if you do their side quests. There's a few, but they're very, very sparse. But a lot of the ones, the side quests that end in the character dying, they either kind of show that the character was just kind of, you were given a sort of facade of that character, and what you are actually getting is just, you know, completely different. Or it gives that character a fitting end. Sure, they might die, but they go out on their terms. I feel like at its core, Elden Ring is almost existentialist in a way. Because everything is kind of given this idea of decay, or everything breaking apart. Because you have all these stories about great characters and great stories, and things are not going well. And sure, that's kind of the point of the story, but there's the idea of the heroes die the hero's death, and because of that, they die. That sounded a lot cooler in my head. Take, for example, a character like Godwyn. You learn about Godwyn, you learn that he's essentially Giga Chad. He's Baldur, he's Jesus, like he's all of the above. Like, not only is he's the most powerful demigod, but he's also a demigod that not only makes friends with the dragons he's supposed to kill, like Landseeks and Fortisax, he also cares for the cursed twins, Mikkel and Melania, when it's presumed that they were kind of ostracized from so much. He's essentially this character that defies all the expectations. Where is he in game? Dead for a while. Like, this guy's gone. And sort of the subverting of all of the factions is something that Elden Ring does very, very well. I think a good example of this is Golden Order, which, when playing, the idea is you're repairing the Golden Order, you're fixing it up. But then as you go throughout the game, you find more and more problems. Because I mentioned in Breath of the Wild, the game doesn't really reward you for really doing anything to well, you can explore, you can get new items, but it doesn't really give you anything where it's like, I have a better understanding of the world. You're just given more items. That's why you explore. In Elden Ring, it has quite possibly the best reward for that I've ever seen. And it's not really a reward at all, because basically you've got Leyndell, mid-game, massive capital area. Like, you could spend hours exploring it and not find anything. It's a very triumph of game design. Underneath it, you have the sewers of Leyndell, which are even more confusing. Less expansive, but it's a lot more tight-knit. Then, if you go underneath that, you end up finding this massive cathedral hidden underground, where you fight a boss that's admittedly a repeat, but still a fun fight. And you kind of get all that, and you have the idea of, whoa, I got a good incantation from that, and I explored everything. That's great. I'm content. But at the same time, you have questions like, why is there a cathedral here? What's with the omens? What's with everything? What is down here that needs to be sealed? Why is this called the Cathedral of the Forsaken? That's an awesome name. Why is it called that? It went so far from the omens themselves, which would normally be the Forsaken. And then you see the messages on the ground where it's like, hit wall, therefore crying, or something like that. And you're like, okay, you walk up to the wall in the back and you hit it, and then you walk forward. And this is the moment that essentially made me go, oh crap, Elden Ring is like one of the best games ever made. It's not really the bosses, it wasn't the game design, it wasn't the world, it was this moment. Because you walk in, and previously when the ideas of the Golden Horde, it's mainly like talking about essentially the idea of religion, of zealotry, and like the problems that can pop up when you're really, really dialed into that. But this is something that not only, because I mentioned this sort of feeling like real world history, this is something that reflects that in an absolutely genius way. Because you walk in and you find another passage, because, you know, it's a Dark Souls game. But there's no music. You just hear a solo violin that's playing a very haunting melody that's nowhere else in the game. It's just this violin echoing. And then you walk forward. Throughout the game, you found traveling merchants who have sold you stuff. Only one of them is named Kale. They sell you stuff, they give you stuff. But most of the time, they're just kind of kooky characters that are just here. You wonder what's going on, you feel sad for them. That's kind of it. And then you find a body of one. And another. You walk forward, and this area is essentially one of the catacomb dungeons you're so used to, but it's full of corpses of these merchants, because you realize that the reason that they're wandering is because there was a genocide. This Elden Ring has given you this faction that's supposedly the good guys that you're trying to repair, and then it gives you this image of peoples that are completely shut away, that were persecuted, that were just isolated in every single way, driven from society. It shows you a genocide that is almost disturbingly real in how it's presented. Not physically, but in terms of like it being hidden where no one can ever really accept it. It gives you this. It gives the ultimate nail in the coffin of what could be considered a good faction. And then, there at the bottom, it gives you a different one. Elden Ring, in this one fell swoop, has given you the reward for exploring, a huge heap of lore and thematic meat, just meat on the bones, and an entirely new ending with the Three Fingers. It gives all the optimism of the Golden Order, of the, like, religious side of things, of the zealotry. I'm opening the door, it's getting... This doorknob's stupid. I'm opening the door, it's getting hot. It gives you all of these things in one turn. It gives you it shows you optimism and zealotry and says this is what that results in, and then it gives you the Three Fingers. It gives you the Flame of Frenzy. It gives you this nihilist view of everything, which, to get all the Steam achievements, I have to do the Frenzy Flame ending at some point, but I really don't want to. It gives you that option, which I think is just amazing. And even all the other endings, they're really given no idea of good guys, quote unquote, because everything there's a problem. Take, for example, Ranni. Ranni's main goals are essentially both for herself and for those around her. She wants to essentially bring about the Age of Stars so she can't be controlled by the greater will. She's essentially doing this as a defiance to allow herself to decide her own fate. And also as a way so that nobody has to experience the same thing. That's really good. That's altruistic. She hangs out with Blythe and Iji, who are awesome. And then at the same time, you realize that the reason she's able to be in that state is because she was literally the person who caused everything to go to shit. Ranni is given this sort of characterization of being simultaneously one of the best options if you want to preserve the world, but also the person who helped destroy it in the Night of the Black Knives and the Shattering. And so knowing the lore, you get more out of it. It's not like if you play the game without knowing that, it's not like there's nothing there or you can never understand it or anything like that. It's still a good time, but knowing this, knowing the story, it rewards you for finding these things. And take another example, like Mikkel and Melania, who I mentioned earlier. Mikola essentially occupies this weird sort of space where he defies everything. He's a part of the Golden Order, but then he finds out that that can't help heal his sister from the Scarlet Rot. And so he forms his own faction, and by doing that helps people who have been oppressed, like the Albinorix, like the Kindred of Rot, like the Demi-Humans, all of those things. He essentially builds this entire separate faction, the Halig Tree, in order to allow these people and to allow his sister to flourish. There's that one piece of cut dialogue that is supposedly attributed to him, where he says, "In my world, all things will flourish, whether graceful or benign." He's given this sense of altruism that is just incredible. And then, in Elden Ring being Elden Ring, it goes horribly wrong. For some reason or another, he needs to unlock the stars to resurrect Godwyn. And so, doing that, Malenia has to fight Radahn. None of these words make sense if you don't understand the story. I'm so sorry. Go watch VaatiVidya, he helps out a lot. But in doing that, Mikola gets kidnapped. So essentially, in this act of altruism and taking steps to fix the world, he's punished for it. Malenia ends up fighting a futile battle that accomplishes nothing, where Radahn is still alive, she is still alive, but Radahn's gone insane, and she's literally crumbling apart. The game, Elden Ring's world, doesn't exactly reward heroism, which is something that is a lot more interesting. Because you have these characters who are heroic in some way. You've got Alexander, you've got, I don't know, Tregoth doesn't have a piece of, like, lore. Okay, Rajier. Alexander, Rajier, Millicent, Corrin, kind of Corrin, he's a bit of a dick. All these people. And this heroism is rewarded with things going bad. Rajier is consumed by death because he wants to help people he wants to help those who live in death. Essentially, he's doing like civil he's going for civil rights for skeletons. What a Chad. And then he ends up dying for it, which is very sad. You've got somebody like Millicent, where she is granted the opportunity to be able to find out how she fits into the world, and decides to use that to help to try to call back to Malenia, but sadly dies in the act. Although she does get to go out on her own terms. Millicent is the best NPC in Elden Ring, and I will take no further comments. And then Alexander, he's just looking for a good time. He's being an inspiration to his fellows, and then he ends up feeling a deep amount of shame for having to be helped by the character, and thus challenges the character, trying to go out on his own terms. The game doesn't reward heroism, and because of that, it feels like your character doing heroic things is something very, very noble. It's not just you're doing the right thing, it's you're fighting for the right thing. And this is where probably my biggest gripe with Elden Ring comes in. And that's the fact that at its core, it's still a FromSoft game. It's still an RPG. And because of that, I kind of slid into this idea of I'm playing as a character who, while part of a faction who's done a lot of bad things, is still inevitably seeking to help the world. Like, fighting Radahn so that Wirani's fate can be unlocked, and so that Radahn can die the noble death that he always wanted. Like, going through all these things. But then at the same time, you've got the irreconcilable truth of the matter that playing the game, you're doing so many things that you don't line up with that altruism. You go to the Halig Tree and you find all these cool bosses. I go to the Halig Tree because I want to see the Halig Tree and I want to experience all this stuff. The Tarnished is going to the Halig Tree because they're a power-hungry son of a gun. Like, there's this sort of dissonance here between what the Tarnished is doing and what you playing as the Tarnished is doing. And they can't coexist. It rubs up against each other. Alright, I don't really know what else there is to say. Good bosses. Oh, the music. I can mention the music. The soundtrack's great. It could be better. As for me, I like soundtracks that feel a little more active. While I love ambient music, a lot of the time just going throughout the game, like Farum Azula, Leyndell, Altus, the music for those areas is amazing, and it really helps you kind of slip into this idea of the world. But I also like some soundtracks that are a bit more active, a little more focused on leitmotifs, which Elden Ring doesn't really do all that much. Most of the boss fights don't stick in your head all that much. In fact, the reason I remember the boss fights are because of Cthulhu Seeker's synthwave arrangements of them, which, check his stuff out. It's freaking legit. Like, for example, like, I remember Melania's theme, the Fire Giant theme, Radahn's theme. Those are all excellent, but you don't really feel those in-game. And there's no real leitmotifs to back it up. There's not really this feeling of anything more than, this is a good track. Not, this piece is in and of itself the culmination of everything else. I think another example of that is Radagon's boss fight, which, first half, it's literally the main theme. Which is like, guys, you could do better than this! It feels cheap to just have, oh look, final boss, here's the main theme. No, like, have something else before that, and then have, like, the main theme come in with the metal chair. Have that happen. For example, like, take the second part, the Elden Beast fight, where it's like, it's had this really nice melody thing, but what if it went from, like, oh, wait, hold on, the speaker's off. What if it went from something like that? And then you have the something like that, where the main theme comes back in a way where it's like, oh, that's interesting. A lot of the time it just feels like which this is just kind of how it works for a lot of this sort of style of games, and I think that somewhat lines up with some of the, no, never mind, I'm not going to say, that's just not true. I was going to say like some of the more modern Japanese composing, but that's just not the case. But it's definitely the case in Elden Ring, where the soundtrack almost feels like it's looking down on the player. Which, at the same time, there is an inherent genius to it. Like, I mentioned the solo violin earlier of the Wandering Merchants. Those are two songs that are just a repeated little thing with one track, one voice, and they're amazing. They're probably the highlight of the entire soundtrack, in my opinion. But at the same time, those are kind of in isolation to everything else. Every song feels like it's in a bubble. When you fight Rennala, you don't have the idea of what Rennala's sort of music is going to feel like, which, while is very beautiful, it's an excellent highlight of the soundtrack, you don't have the pretense for it from Raya Lucaria, from doing that level. Which, while it could be like, oh, it's a surprise for the boss, like, you already pretty much knew that you were gonna fight Rennala. You have all these hints saying, oh, you're fighting Rennala, you're probably gonna fight Rennala. Like, it wasn't really a secret. And the soundtrack, I think, should have done something similar, where instead of having this weird, like, Harry Potter LSD trip of an ambient theme, have something more active, something more motivically driven. Yeah, couple standout tracks I will mention. Fire Giant theme. While I don't like that fight very much, and I feel like it's a bit of a letdown, we have to stop sleeping on that boss fight theme. That cello at the beginning. Oh my gosh! It's so good. I mentioned Rennala's boss fight theme. Ancestor Spirit's good. Second half of the final battle, which I kind of alluded to there. Pretty sure I just played it completely differently. But yeah. I have now spent half an hour talking about Elden Ring. I hope this is enough to maybe either convince you to play it if you have, like, give it another shot. For those of you who haven't, don't really care, watch VaatiVidya. He has excellent videos called Prepare to Cries, which essentially delve into sort of the microcosms of this. And another thing that I will say, there's a YouTube channel called The Tarnished Archaeologist, which essentially approaches so many mysteries in Elden Ring's lore and world from an archaeologist's perspective and uses that lens, and it is legitimately so good. Like, these people looked at the Divine Towers and pieced that together with, like, an entire lost civilization that you don't even notice until you notice it. Elden Ring is such a good game. There's just little bits that I feel like could be ironed out, but still, so good. This is how I kind of came around to it because the story slaps. All right, I think that's all I'm gonna say. I've run out of words. Maybe I might write this down, put it in a way that's slightly cooler. I don't know. All right, yeah, I don't know if I'll ever post again. Peace.